Hi, everyone. Today we're very fortunate to have two of the literally smartest people that I know in the entire world. Peter Coffee from Salesforce, who will be joining me in a second, and Richard Whitt, who was at a company called Google and has now struck out on his own. But they're both doing some amazing things. So let me just start by asking you to say a few words about yourself. Peter, we'll go alphabetical order.
It's going to be an interesting 5-year gig at Salesforce. I think I may have been the first person at the company to have the word platform in his job title, because when I started, we were just on the verge of beginning to offer people the CRM without the CRM on top, and in the same way as if Windows had originally only been sold as Office, and then they had the bright idea of letting you buy the Windows thing without that and see if people could do something with that. So the idea of the cloud platform is just about as old as my job there. And now there are millions of applications that we did not write running on our stuff. So it seems as if there was the germ of an idea there.
Yeah, I think Salesforce is probably going to do okay as a startup. That's
I joined a 2,000-person company 12 years ago, 34,000 now, and we're just a piece of a much larger, what IDC likes to call Salesforce economy, which is multiple billions of dollars globally. I'm sorry, billions of billions of dollars, whatever.
Got it. That's a large number.
Is that a bucks?
Richard, how about you? What's your background?
So 11 years at Google. While I was there for about 7 of those years, I was the principal person on network neutrality. So any carrier later on who wants to gang up and beat me up in the back, that's totally fine. Before that, I was 12 years at MCI Communications. I left Google in May, and I'm now doing a small tech startup in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm a fellow with Mozilla and a senior fellow at Georgetown Tech Law Policy Institute. And the shorthand is...
We only have 25 minutes.
I want to create a trustworthy...
That's the problem with people
web.
with these great bios.
Yeah. So,
okay, so like I said, smart guys. So the purpose of this panel is we have a lot of network people here that started off in protocol design or selling subsea networks and so forth. But we traditionally have not had as much going on at the application layer. So we have two people that are obviously deeply familiar with applications. And what we really want to do is understand the interplay between emerging application requirements and network capabilities. And kind of kick things off, some of you may know that it's probably 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago, there was a very famous paper that came out called The Rise of the Stupid Network. And the fundamental premise of the paper was that because networks have to connect a variety of heterogeneous endpoints, what you really wanted to do was keep the network protocols as dumb as possible and let the application edge do all the necessary work. And so at the same time, what we see is that telcos are trying to grow their revenues and trying to add value where possible and capture some of all the money that you guys have been scooping out of the ecosystem.
Oh, yeah.
And so the question is, what's the right balance, and how will emerging applications like autonomous vehicles or telehealth change all that? So,
well, Joe, I felt almost as if I had jumped in a time machine this morning, because in one of the first conversations you and I ever had, probably about 10 years ago, you observed that the difficult thing to do is to build a global network. Only a small handful of companies in the world with the competency to do that, and that scarcity should suggest that you would wind up being the key people and the source of profitability in this emerging thing that 10 years ago, we were just beginning to use this word cloud. Well, then Mr. Miglani was up on stage this morning, and he essentially made the exact same assertion. The network is the hard thing to do. There aren't very many of them. Therefore, we should own the network and all the things that get done on that. And I'm thinking, well, are we turning another 10-year crank? Because where is the profitability actually emerging? Stephen Ho commented on the plumbers conference and the metaphor of the network as plumbing. And a few months ago, I actually finally thought I should put some numbers on that, and I looked it up. The profit margin on plumbing, pipes, is about 3%. And the profit margin on the fancy bathroom fixtures that arguably define the experience, that are, if you will, the application layer of running water, is more like 30%. And I think the metaphor has some power to it. The value add of creating differentiated experience is kind of important, and there's only so much differentiation to be achieved by talking about things like your latency and your throughput.
I have so many funny things that I can't say based on that analogy, so I'm going to
I can imagine where bathroom humor could go astray.
Exactly right.
So yeah,
but
right.
that's exactly right.
So it's really important if you want to have not merely revenue growth. It's very clear from this morning. Revenue growth is going to be abundant. Profitability growth, I think everyone ought to be asking the question, what am I going to do?
When you say revenue growth is going to be abundant, you mean for the application providers? Or
No,
you
I mean revenue growth for the network providers. Revenue growth, I mean, we saw the numbers for Africa. We've seen what the satellites are going to be able to deliver in terms of services to people who are currently terribly underserved. Your ability to deliver very high bandwidth, very rich content, well, that's going to grow, and that's revenue. But profit implies differentiation and a perception of value.
So this would be an interesting topic for another session, which we probably can't cover, around ARPU versus overall revenue growth through market development.
Sure.
But let's table that for a second, because I do want to get Richard in,
please.
especially because you're working on an exciting new initiative, and maybe you could share with people, because it's not so much on the revenue side, it's more on the consumer protection side. So if you could explain your new capabilities that are really critical to helping this whole ecosystem evolve, that would be great. And separately, anyone in the audience can ask a question, except probably for Dean, because your questions are going to be too deep for the rest of us to process. And we have mics allegedly, so just before we finish up, I'll open it up for a question or two. But anyway, Richard, please.
Yeah, so my project builds on the Rise of the Stupid Network paper by David Eisenberg you mentioned earlier, which in turn builds on the notion of the end-to-end principle that David Reed, David Clark, and others came up with in the 80s. And that's this notion of intelligence and control and autonomy happening at the edges of the network, and that there be a relatively undifferentiated pipe in between. I think one of the great ironies of the past 15 to 20 years that I've seen, particularly in my time at Google, is that the edge companies have now essentially become the core, right? So we were supposed to disintermediate with the web, get rid of all those nasty costs, all those frictions in the middle, and just have this user-directed experience into this wide-open internet. Somewhere along the way, the platform companies figured out, hey, we can still be intermediaries, except we don't have quite the same fiduciary obligations that the other intermediaries of the past would have. And so my observation has been, particularly over the past 3 to 5 years, and we're seeing it play out in lots of things around privacy and fake news and the like, is that end users need more autonomy, more control, and more choice. The way to do that is to actually bring intermediaries back into the game. But at this time, it's going to be those who are chosen by the end user with an actual fiduciary relationship, a duty of loyalty between the end user and that platform. And in turn, that platform then can help arm the end user with the kinds of tools they need in the online and increasingly the offline world to basically defend themselves and promote their own interests as other things are coming at them from the platforms and from the rest of the open web.
And what you're talking about is really important, because when I talk about differentiation, that might sound like the opposite of the interoperability that we all value. And I'm not talking about eliminating interoperability, but it is possible to add the kind of thing you're talking about, where there are levels of assurance and levels of relationship that become differentiating and therefore profitable, without in any way compromising the underlying standards-based interoperability that's so important to a network's planet.
So the analogy that comes to mind is the traditional differential in power between the corporation and the employee, right? So the corporation has lots of lawyers and lots of deep pockets and so forth, and the poor employee is just an individual. But what I hear you saying is, by creating an intermediary like a labor union, it's that labor union that then now you're negotiating with the union president, who can represent the collective interests of all of the employees, and therefore rebalance the power between the giant internet companies around the world and the individual whose privacy rights could be violated. Is that a safe,
essentially,
rough analogy?
And the intermediary could be anybody. So it can be an existing entity like an ISP. It could be
the class action lawsuit model.
Sort of the class action lawsuit model, but basically it's getting away from the current model in which we have users, right? And the users of the platform, as we were talking about today at breakfast, the users have now become the objects, not the subjects, of these interactions with the web. And that's not the way actually it was intended. If you go back to 20 to 30 years to the Eisenberg and Clark and et cetera papers, it was really about empowered folks at the edge using their control to create the experiences that benefit them and their families and their communities.
And so how do you actually operationalize that? In other words, the concept is great that I have now sort of a rebalancing of power between the users, and the expression that we talked about this morning is, I think you had several different great variations of it. But
if you're not paying, you're the product, not the customer, and if you don't know who the mark is at the table, it's you.
Exactly.
Yeah, those are two common ways of putting that one.
to live by. So how do you actually operationalize that vision, though? Is it regulatory? Is it technology? Is it, you know, some sort of intermediate fund? What do you?
Yeah, so one can assume that the existing larger platform companies are not going to voluntarily head in this direction. They could. I think it's actually in their best interest long term, perhaps to foreclose sort of competition arguments and privacy arguments against them. But I think what I'm looking for, I think is much more interesting, is an opt-in environment where you actually have entities who agree to take on these higher standards of care, particularly now in the post-network neutrality world. Frankly, I think this is a golden opportunity for ISPs who have existing relationships with end users, who get monthly subscription fees. You know, there already is a level of trust, level of understanding there between themselves as customers and agents. Take that relationship and build on it. And you can do things, frankly, with that over time Google and Facebook cannot do, including getting actual relevant advertising based on protecting the end user's data locally, making sure their identity they project to the web is based on what they want to do, localizing AIs on mobile devices, so it's not just, again, me sort of vulnerable to Alexa or Cortana sitting in the living room. So it's giving the tools to the end user and representing their interests to the web in ways that are financially remunerative, and then also give back that autonomy to the user.
The world of shipping physical stuff figured out this idea a long time ago because you had multiple modes of transport, ships, planes, and so on, people who are very good at bulk stuff but not very good at high speed, whatever. And so you had these companies emerge that are called freight forwarders, where you engage them to be, in effect, your personal shopper in a multimodal world, and they have purchasing power, and they have the ability to conduct audits and inspections at a level that you as an individual shipper of stuff do not. And I can imagine that we'll see layers emerge, not unlike, you know, the way the open source model works a lot today. Why was Red Hat worth 1/3 of IBM's market cap? Presumably because even though all the code was open source, there were layers of understanding about how to, you know, manage it and deploy it and manage and run it successfully that were of value. And I think we have an opportunity for network carriers to grow new layers on the business that are, if you will, concierge bandwidth, where you can buy the raw stuff if you really want to, or you can go to the deli counter and buy a much more finished product.
Well, that's a great idea. Let me ask you from the perspective of Salesforce,
sure.
Which is now engaged in so many different industries. What is it that, to this audience of network service providers, you would tell them, or from the Google perspective, if I can go back, or an anonymous prior employer with whom you may have some familiarity.
Start up in a garage.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What is it that you would say? Is everything coming in terms of network evolution, including SDN and NFV and smart networks and interoperability?
We have strategic partnerships with, among others, Amazon, Nokia, other people that some people assume are our competitors, and they really are not. Nokia, and I've had some great conversations about trying to communicate the notion that 5G is not just another turn of the crank for faster bandwidth, but now starting to have much more of a nuanced relationship of, well, am I purchasing low latency, or am I purchasing high data integrity? Am I going to be driving cars with this network traffic, or am I just going to be doing quarterly business reports?
But I guess my question is, do you see, is that a critical driver of value, or are all of the telcos and the network equipment vendors that are creating these technologies for you, are you going to say, that's great, but you know what, it's really not that germane to our business?
We are moving into...
I stumped Peter Coffee for a few seconds. That's the first time I've ever seen him think for more than a second.
I don't want to get fired for this answer.
Okay,
that's
right.
what.
That's the...
But we are obviously moving into businesses that are not what people think of in terms of our traditional province. We are doing a lot of work now in Internet of Things spaces that include running smart cities, moving much more toward real-time type environments and not just business transactional type environments. And so we have people here at PTC, other than myself, I think maybe for the first time, who are here to start doing quite deep and thorough conversations with bandwidth providers about, if you will, not just buying running water, but buying, running Cabernet and running Pinot Noir. There's going to be much more specificity to the types of network capacity that we will be interested in acquiring, I believe.
So that's a very positive message for everyone,
I hope
right?
so.
It's that,
sure.
Whereas for the prior 20 years of your existence, you might have said, whatever, it's fine.
We bought
now
fungible
you're actually,
bandwidth, yeah.
Exactly.
We bought commodity bandwidth. And now I think we're going to be buying much more segmented mixtures of type of capability as we move into a much more diverse portfolio of types of user and types of traffic and types of need.
Great. And Richard, from your perspective, given your wide industry background, what would you say?
In terms of particularly what?
Well, here's the basic question. Look, I've been in this industry since before you guys were even born. And basically the story has been always looking for how do we grow revenues by entering adjacent markets and considering the adjacent possible. And what you have seen the telcos do traditionally over the last decades is, here's a great opportunity, we're going to make this great investment, and then later on there's a retrenchment, right? So, for example, see Donna, AT&T's data centers, AT&T made a big pitch and it was great, and then it backed off, as did all the majors in one way or another. So it's this constant struggle to say, we really want to add value as a way of growing revenues, but there isn't necessarily a willingness to pay, and it's back to that.
Well, I'm not sure you can do better than the statement that was made by Mr. Collar, was it, from Empower, where he said, we're realizing that people don't want to buy a transponder, they want to buy a service. And I think it's very easy for technology-dominated companies where the scarce thing is getting it working to think that because that's the hard part of what you do, that must be your product. And it's been a challenge for many companies to realize the customer doesn't want to be told how hard it was. Remember Morgan Freeman's line in Batman when Bruce Wayne says, am I supposed to understand any of that? And he says, no, I just wanted you to know how hard it was. We've been telling our customers for decades in these industries how hard it is and expecting them to respect and value that, and they don't care. They just want the dial tone. They just want low latency. They just want low packet loss. They want operating experience, and now we have to get better at realizing that we have to subordinate our egos and give them what they want to pay for.
Let me let Richard answer, but there's also a difference between what people theoretically want versus what they don't not want. That might be a quadruple negative, but in other words, simply avoiding hassle is not necessarily a way of growing up. Dean, what did I say? Okay, so Richard, why don't you answer?
I was going to say, I think the point I would suggest is that we should move past actually even the service designation and move to people want an agent. People want an agent, somebody to navigate the online world for them, which is becoming complex and scary and frustrating and anger-inducing. And then increasingly, when you move to the offline space, right, with IoT and machine learning bots out there and sensors and everything, facial recognition happening, I think that's when many people are going to wake up and say, wait a minute, the norms that we have sort of uneasily accepted in the online world, which is you take all my data and I get free cat videos, I'm not sure I want that anymore for me and my family. I need someone there to help me. I need someone there to hold my hand and say, it's okay, the technology can still be there to support and promote your interests. You've got a shield here, you've got somebody there to sort of represent you. That, I think, is the agency notion, I think, is going to be the one over the next 3 to 5 years that may start moving to the surface.
Well, it's been a source of mystery to me for literally decades that you can't buy a toaster without a tag on the cord saying that Underwriters Laboratories or some other equivalent has certified that this thing is unlikely to kill you if used as directed. And yet, with these services that we understand less, we get less benefit from people certifying basic things like there's been some analysis of the API. I mean, the whole Cambridge Analytica thing was essentially Facebook saying, no, they didn't hack us. They just used our APIs in a way that we claim we didn't
in a way we allegedly didn't intend, exactly.
And so, is that good news that they didn't have to be hacked to take that data out? That all that was required was that the APIs be used as designed? That's the good news?
Yes.
Wow.
That was from that perspective.
That's really strange.
But the problem is now we have Toaster as a service, right? That's the thing. These devices are no longer just with the ULs on the bottom. Now, if you touch it or do anything to it, you void the
And
warranty.
the notion that there's no auditing of APIs to establish that there are boundaries, that there are some kind of governance mechanism.
There allegedly is, and then every few months there's a new loophole that's discovered that oops, sorry. So let me just say, if there's any questions from the audience, Dean, you're still on, you want to jump in? Feel free if there's a mic. We got mic runners. Hold up your hand. I'd rather make sure you're happy than...
Well, if there's anyone else, yeah. Thanks for the warning. Sorry, Jay. There's two different answers here, though. We've got Richard saying we should have agents that essentially allow, abstract the complexity from us and allow us to arbitrage amongst multiple things behind that on the web or wherever. But Peter, you're essentially saying we should have optimizations and categorizations of one thing. So what's the answer here? Do you, so in a way, Richard, it's like the sort of SD-WAN view of connectivity. It's like, you know what, we'll have 5 different pipes and we'll arbitrage between them, load balance, pick whichever's fastest. And Peter's view is, actually, I want one pipe, which is my specified pipe.
I think the answer to your question is that I don't believe either of us thought we were in a mutually exclusive situation here. I believe the market will demand and will support both types of manner of purchase.
And who's the customer? I mean, I'm thinking, I guess, more of the typical consumer model. And I think yours is probably more geared towards enterprise and companies and maybe folks who are a little more sophisticated in terms of what they're looking for in the day from the market.
Yeah, we sell to companies.
Yeah, and but I think the point is, the larger point is these things can all work together. And the platforms will still be there. I mean, in my perspective, we're not going to replace them overnight. I'd like to create sort of an adjacent parallel web universe where these kinds of things can happen, and then let the market dictate.
Yeah, to be very clear, I want protocols to remain non-proprietary. I want a packet to be able to move. Someone this morning said, the speed of light in fiber is pretty much a global uniform thing. I want packets to be able to go everywhere, but I want to be able to create value-adding services around them on many different axes.
If there's another question, jump up and wave because it's hard to see in the audience. So, and if not, we'll just do a wrap-up. No questions on the future of telecommunications and global ICT strategy. Everyone's got it all solved, I guess.
Well, we did say we were going to talk about the pitfalls, and I think among the pitfalls is that this is no longer an intra-industry conversation. When identity theft stops being a topic discussed by spooks and legislators and goes into the pages of the Ladies' Home Journal, and this is something that everybody is, there's now a visibility here that I think is going to require all of us to be much more candid and allow a degree of audit and inspection and to some degree regulation. I think Brian Schatz was exactly right when he said you don't legislate the details in a rapidly evolving situation because that invites clever people to find technically compliant ways of doing the wrong thing. The Communications Act of 1934 was an extraordinary piece of legislation that opened the door to decades of stuff that couldn't possibly have been imagined by anyone but maybe Arthur C. Clarke at the time that that law was passed. And it provided the right amount, I think, of context for getting a lot of good things done. And I think we now need to have that at something resembling a global level. I observed on Twitter this morning how many people watch the Oscars and the Super Bowl and have no idea that the World Radio Communications Conference even exists. I think there needs to be more appreciation of the degree to which these global processes are as close as we come to a world government that really works.
I think the answer to both of those is not as many as did last year, seems to be the trend line. But just sort of last question on sort of this emerging environment is, and it probably goes to Dean's question, how much of it is industry self-regulation on behalf of the over-the-top players, especially given that a certain company had a 50 million euro fine this morning or whatever it was that was announced because of a GDPR violation, and how much of it is technology, how much of it is users kind of, finally realizing what's being done with their data?
It's a mix of things. So there are many who believe we should go out and regulate the platform providers. Others say let's rely on self-regulation. I think either of those courses are interesting and probably require some merit. My own perspective, though, is I would prefer to try to build a market-based alternative to what's there now, and perhaps require interfaces and protocols that allow you to interoperate with the platforms and get access to data, much more free flow of data, but again, at the end user's discretion, not the platform's discretion. No more Equifaxes out there, right? No more notion of data being out on a server farm
next week.
waiting to be hacked. It's data localized and controlled by the end user in a cloudlet in the first instance.
Great. We are out of time.
Yes,
I apologize. Okay. But we have time to just say you guys will both be around for a couple of days?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm here through one.
So Peter Coffee, Richard Whitt, two great guys, brilliant guys. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.